Thank you very much, Randa. Thank you for having me. Today we are going to talk about international trade, recent trends. But first, I would like to briefly introduce some key statistics on global trade. In 2025, global trade was about $35 trillion, and with 26 trillions in goods and about 9 trillions in services. Now, considering a global economy which is worth about 110 trillion, this means that about 1/3 of global output is moved across borders. So that's a big chunk of global production. Another point is that trade has increased a lot during the last few decades. Just in 25 years ago, trade was only 8 trillion, and the global economy was a lot lower than now, of course, about 34 trillions, and trade over GDP, so the amount of the percentage of goods and services moved across borders was only 25%. So during the last 25 years, we have seen what people refer generally to as globalization. So what are the main reasons for this growth? And the three main reasons is that during the last few decades, there's been an amazingly increased efficiency in international production networks. So companies have been seeking to maximizing profits and revenues by leveraging cost differential, producing goods where factor cost, labor, environment, and things were cheaper. And that creates a lot of movement of goods around the world. The second thing is that trade costs have gone down during the last 20 or even 30 years. And this was a result of a lot more efficient shipping logistics. So all the trade infrastructure increased dramatically. Also, during start from the late, early 90s, there was a constant reduction of tariff under the WTO and then under regional trade agreements that contributed to a strong reduction in trade cost and so on. And then there was standard harmonization and trade facilitation measure, which also contributed a lot in reducing the transaction cost across borders. And finally, what was very important is that cross-border transaction needs trust, or they need also a predictable international legal system. So a system of trade rules that is enforceable and is universally recognized, and this was the role of the WTO and still is. So those are the three main forces that contributed to the globalization. Now, I would also ask that most of those forces now are under they have been weakening, and this is where we are now. So the next slide goes a little bit back in time, and I promise this is the last one that goes back in time. I'll focus on the most recent trend in the next slides of my presentation. But this tells you that by historical standards, we are in a very good period for global trade. And this golden period started about 15 years ago, or maybe even 20. And the trade over GDP, this is only goods without services because we go back 200 years, reached about 25%. So we are really at maybe a physiological limit about trade over GDP, but also what is important is that during the last 15 years, this trend did not increase, but has been very volatile. And something of concern is that this volatile trend was also present twice in recent history and was before World War I and before World War II. Those were periods of strong geopolitical tensions, which eventually result in very dramatic events, but that's where we are at the moment. I hope this is not any, that doesn't have any predictive things, but we see that this has been already present in the past. Now, going to more recent trends, we see that regardless of all what happened in the last year or so, in terms of trade policy and things that geopolitical tensions, global trade has increased a lot during 2025. So in value, trading goods has increased by about 7% and trading services by about 8%. So that's a big increase, but it's also an increase due to the volatility that we experienced in the last few years. And this trend has increased across all quarters. So both trading goods and services have increased across all quarters. So in this case, the volatility that we have observed in the last few years was not replicated during the last 4 quarters, which is a good sign, I would say. Now, you may have also heard that there have been a lot of concern about inflation during the last year or so. And it's true, part of the increase in trade is actually not, is nominal rather than real, but still a lot of it has been real. So the trade volumes during 2025 has increased, not by 7% or 6%, but more like around 3%. So inflation of traded goods, we quantify it in about 4% during 2025. So what were the drivers of trade growth during the last year? And one big thing is that there was a lot of trade about goods related to artificial intelligence and also services and tech infrastructure. So as you know, there's been a huge investment in data center, in artificial intelligence servers and things like that. And this sector is a sector which is very much trade intensive. By some estimates, each dollar invested in artificial intelligence and tech infrastructure creates about 80 cents of trade, because a lot of these goods are produced in one region of the world and used in another region of the world. So investment in this sector, and we see that there have been a lot of investment in these sectors, have created quite a bit of trade. Another thing is the ongoing servicification of trade and digital trade, and servicification is services within manufacturing. So when you buy a phone, it's a manufacturing product, but actually you also buy a lot of services with it. And that's how those are contributed to trade to global trade in recent time. Also, what is contributing to global trade is the diffusion of the trade of green goods, especially in relation to energy. So solar panel, wind turbines, and things that produce energy in a different way than fossil fuels, and also transportation, meaning electric cars or hybrid cars, and also more efficient engines and things like that. Also, what we observe, and this is also a trend that's been going on during not only in 2025 but also before that South-South trade has been growing above average, and this is generally a result of East Asia, especially China, and so it's very heterogeneous. We see big increases in some region and not so big increases in other regions, or a lot more volatile trends in some region than others. And also from a business perspective, we see that in spite of all the trade policy and trade restriction that has been going on during the last year, especially multinational companies were able to mitigate some of those measures by triangulating trade or multi-shoring. So this creates additional trade. Now, to give you some numbers, during what happened during 2025, we see that the region that where trade increased the most, both in terms of exports and imports, was East Asia. So a region which was very much already trading a lot. And this East Asia in this graph exclude China. And we have China on the bottom left. And also another region which actually has been increasing a lot in terms of export and imports is Africa. But this is a region that was trading very little, so in values, this didn't contribute a lot to global trade, but East Asia did. In regard, and those are like, the numbers you see here, or the graph you see here, are actually the difference from the global averages. So the interpretation of this, that Asia grow a lot faster than global averages, Africa as well, while China has grown less than global averages, especially in terms of imports, by still being growing. India and Russia Federation are probably the countries where growth was more muted. Now, one also big story, a big event that we have witnessed during 2025 was the US-China trade decoupling, or what you want to call it, meaning that those two economies are now trading a lot less, at least in relative terms, that we were trading 5 or 10 years ago. So, for example, in 2015, the trade between China and the US was about 4% of global trade. In 2025, this was about 2%. So this has created quite a bit of trade diversions, because both countries actually are importing a lot more and exporting a lot more than they were 10 years ago. So this creates some other channels between channels from which trade is being directed now. And this other graph show you that this decoupling between the largest economies on the world has created a number of what are generally referred to as connector economies. And those economies are economies that trade a lot more, both with US and China. So they connect global trade, they still contribute to global trade, and probably some of them at least connect those two big economies which now trade a lot less. What also is important is that in spite of all the talk about fragmentation and polarization and regionalization, so far the data does not show a lot of those patterns. There are very few countries which have been really moving towards one pole or one region. So a lot of countries actually remain integrated into the broader global economy rather than moving into specific blocks. So this, it's a graph actually that tells, this needs to be explained a little bit. So here, what we look at also is the extent to which trade is being regionalized, and this is the trend about that is referred to about nearshoring, and this is basically the distance for which trade travels on average. So if there is a regionalization, so the distance to which the average trade travels decreases. And what we have observed in this trend is actually that nearshoring, which actually is the opposite of this, has actually not happened. And this means that the trade has actually now has been growing faster between countries which are far away than countries which are close by. Same thing with friendshoring, but friendshoring here is defined as countries within geo-economic blocks, and actually this has increased and has increased really a lot during 2023, then has decreased during 2024 and between 2025 and 2024, and now what we are observing is increasing a little bit more during 2025. Those are trends that needs to be interpreted, but we track them just to see if there are big changes. Finally, also we also track in the global trade update is trade concentration, but this seems to be somewhat cyclical, and this trade concentration it's an indicator of how much global trade is concentrated or is related to the big economy. So if you see a downward part, you would say that global trade of the big economy is growing less than the global trade of the small economy, and vice versa. What we are observing now, it's an upward slope, meaning that trade is being, during 2025, is now more concentrated in relation to the large economies. Now, if we look at some key sectors, and this is maybe, I don't know if you can see it, maybe it's too small. What we have observed in the last year or so, it's a like stagnation basically, and this is actually the blue line. So it's a strong reduction in trade of fossil fuels, and this was before the Hormuz crisis, of course. So this was all crude oil, coal, and LNG value contribution to international trade was negative. What has increased is solar. What has increased is wind and batteries. And also what has decreased, and interestingly so, is critical minerals. But this is all mainly a result of very volatile price of those minerals. So lithium, for example, lost a lot of, the price of lithium went down dramatically during the last year or so. What is more interesting, what I said at the beginning, is the effect on electronics. And this includes the AI infrastructure that I was mentioning before. And what we have seen is that the trade in this and those sectors increased a lot. In 2025, the trade, for example, in semiconductors increased by about 12%, so a lot more than global averages. And in information and communication technologies, it's even almost 20%. So it's a big chunk of global trade, and this big chunk of global trade increased a lot. In terms of motor vehicles, we see that the motor vehicles that are rely on combustion engine went down. On the other side, hybrid vehicles trade increased a lot. Electric vehicles didn't move much, increased a lot during 2024, but not in 2025, also because there were a lot of trade restrictive measures in relation to electric vehicles, especially in developed countries. So another point that we are tracking is global trade imbalances. And those global trade balances are of concern of some countries, and there are various reasons why those are concerned or they should not be a concern. But what we observe is that they are not changing much, at least during the last 2 years. Even before that, I don't have a graph here, but they have been going down. They peaked during COVID, and now they are slowly going down, but they're still very much there. So, and in terms of global trade imbalances, we have two main countries. One is the US, which is running a big trade deficit. The other one is China, which is running a big trade surplus. Another country which is running a trade surplus is Europe, in a certain sense, at least, but not so big, not as big as as China, of course, and Russia. On the deficit side, we have the UK and India. And those are actually quite a bit, quite large. But as I said, those are mainly, I mean, there are only a few countries contributing to these major trade imbalances. Now, this gives you a little bit more detailed information about bilateral trade balances between major economies and not so and middle-sized economies. So what we observed during the last year is that now the largest trade imbalance is not between the US and China, but is actually between the European Union and China. And also what is interesting to see is that the trade balance between US and China has decreased, substantially so, and this is also in relation to US trade policy, of course. What also has decreased is the deficit that the US has with the European Union. So and also what has decreased is the deficit that the US had with Canada. So all these measures that the US has put in place during the last year are resulting in a reduction of US trade deficit. If that is in the interest of the US or not, that's another question, but that's the data that we have. Now, I mean, a lot of what I said you can find in the Global Trade Update, and we track this during every quarter. So the next one is going to be published probably in late June or early July. And there we focus on the latest event, especially in relation to the Strait of Hormuz, which we didn't focus in the last one because we didn't have the data yet and the crisis just started. Now, so if you're interested in understanding on the tool or to learn about the latest trade trend, please go to our website and or subscribe to the newsletters, and you will be alerted when the global trade date comes out. Now, what I think it's important to discuss is a little bit where those changes that we are seeing in relation to trade, what are the drivers or where they originate from. And there, I think trade policy plays a very important part in the last year and also before that. And according to the data that we have, the data both of the WTO or what we are using here is the Global Trade Alert database, is that during the last few years, the number of government intervention in relation to trade is being a lot more. I mean, governments have been a lot more active than they were in the past, and they were a lot more active, especially in implementing trade policy which are discriminatory, both across trading partners and both between domestic and foreign companies. So if you look at what are those measures, and Global Trade Alert actually provide a very detailed overview of what those measures are. I just summarize them in 4 categories and the residual. A lot of them are about subsidies and support for domestic firms. And so a lot of governments, especially the developed countries, are putting a lot of resources, money, into support for domestic industry, especially in emerging sectors, whether they are electrification of power grids or transportations or AI-related infrastructure. So there is a lot of, or even traditional sector as steel, aluminum, copper. So there is a lot of governmental intervention in the form of domestic support, which is happening now, a lot more than in the past. What also we see, there has been an increase in the use of tariff. This originates a lot from the US and not so much from other countries, at least so far. And some NTB on imports. NTB here refer like quotas or price mechanism that relates to imported goods. So there has been some of that as well. Also, what has been what we have observed is that there's been an increase in the use of local content requirements, meaning that especially about procurement process, goods needs to be produced locally or within regional trade agreements. And this relates also to the discussion about the increasing stringency about the rules of origin within regional trade agreements. And this contributes, of course, to fragmentation, will contribute to trade fragmentation more in the next few years. Also, what we have observed is the increase of export measures and controls, and this covers both developing and developed countries. So, why governments are actually using those measures now and they were not used them before, or not so much at least? So what are the drivers of those policy action? And I think there are several factors. The first one is that we are now in a much more competitive and it's a much more competitive global environment. So, and this also related to the emergence of very important new industries. Think about AI infrastructure again, or think about electrification of the transportation. So those are industries which has created a race among especially large countries, companies, and governments are supporting those companies with subsidies and fiscal benefits to try to become competitive as quick as possible. So there is a lot of industrial policy that was not there before. And this industrial policy, it's also relation to try to get market access in partner countries. Also is trying to increase the resilience of global value chain or global production networks, especially in securing the critical inputs for those networks and to secure the output markets. So the key word here is that industrial policy is now a lot more important and supported by governments than it was only 10 years ago. Also, governments need to respond to rapid technological change. So there is a lot of automation, there is a lot of labor replacement, and this puts some strains on employment. So governments are also looking are also concerned about those things. And they are trying to protect the industry, especially those that creates employment. And then also what is going on and what is happening, and this has been happening for a long time actually, is that the government priorities are moving, especially in some countries, from economic objective to non-economic objective, especially in relation to environment. So while in the past the major concern about about governments was about economic growth. Now, especially in developed countries, economic growth is still very important, but there are other elements, including like environmental conservation or pollution, and also social aspects of the economy, including like employment, wages, labor-related issues. So we see that this has those objectives are now integrated into trade policy of countries, especially in regional trade agreements where we see an increasing number of provisions related to environmental issues and social issues. Now, another issue is that the multilateral commitments have been weakening, and have been weakening for two reasons. First is that the WTO is not as strong as it was a few years ago. And the second is that the new economy needs new rules which are not being negotiated on a multilateral way, but rather in a bilateral way. So since the WTO has negotiation been stalled since a long time, the rulemaking is now happening elsewhere. And this elsewhere is largely in bilateral, regional, and plurilateral agreement. So, and this creates a lot of trade policy which can be different across economic bloc of different regions that then will need to be harmonized to a common denominator if it's going to be multilateralized. Finally, what could we say about future patterns for global trade? I think from a consumer perspective, there is still a lot of demand for imported goods. I mean, the positive driver that have been driven trade growth during the last 20 years are going to remain intact. I mean, consumers still demand for affordable, high-quality goods in developed countries, but also increasingly so in developing countries. And also what we are going to see is, we are seeing is that there is an expansion in demand in many developing countries. And the expansion in demand in developing countries is going to increase trade quite a bit. So there is still untapped demand for global goods in many developing countries. Also what we have observed is that in spite of all the trade policy changes, the businesses have adopted a lot of adaptive strategies. So from a business perspective, efficiency remains the most important element of their business model, and they need to adapt to the change policy environment. But they are doing that, and some of the firms are doing that in a very efficient, effective way. And they are doing that through diversification, to rerouting goods in one way, especially if you are a big multinational company, you can do that. If you're a small company, probably not. But if you're like multinational, you are definitely more able, because of resources, because of different production nodes, to adapt your production network to change in trade policy that are happening around the world. And finally, there is going to be, countries are going to look for trust and assurance in, especially if the multilateral trading system is going to be weakening further. And in this sense, I think and that is actually what may create more regionalization, more fragmentation in the global trading system, because eventually global trade needs rules, and if those rules are not done in a multilateral way, they are done in some other fora, and those fora, as I mentioned, are bilateral or RTA. If this continues for a long time, this is surely make trade policy, especially in relation to standards, rules of origin, voluntary sustainability standards, harmonization, different across economic blocks. Therefore, they will create incentive for trade to be more regionalized or fragmented that we have been having so far. Still, I would say that there are quite a bit of negative factors that can go against international trade. And the first one is probably a concern about generalized global oversupply. Companies has become extremely productive, extremely competitive, extremely good at producing goods and shipping goods across the world. And this can create some global oversupply in especially in some sector, things about electric car or even hybrid or like steel. So the concern here is that the global oversupplies can create a spread of unilateral and defensive measure, therefore reducing dramatically trade in those sectors. The second is that we may move faster than expected from a multilateral trading system from differentiated policy. And with differentiated policy is what I mean policy which are different across trading partners. Meaning, and we are observing this actually, we are observing this in 2025 in relation to US trade policy, where the US trade policy moved from a uniform, everybody was, I mean, most of the countries besides those in regional trade agreements were facing MFN tariff, but during 2025, the reciprocal tariff imposed by the US administration highlights this issue, that tariffs were different across trading partners, creating a very much differentiated policy environment, at least in access in the US. Now, if this is going to extend to other countries, could be really an issue for the multilateral trading system and for a system where bigger countries will try to exploit their market power to obtain concession from smaller markets. We hope not to get there, but the last trends were not really, they were a little bit concerning. And then I think what will happen, and this is probably, we'll see more and more in this, at least in the next few years, that more policy action in relation to local content, especially in relation to public procurement, more policy about the rules of origins, especially within regional trade agreements or bilateral trade agreements. And this has been used a lot in the past, and I think is going to be used a lot in the future as well. So, and this means that if you want to have an agreement with me, you need to make sure that the inputs that you're using coming from my country, and this is what or the regional bloc. And also what may happen, we are not observing much of that yet, but I think we should be extremely careful about those type of policies that try to influence the policy of other countries. So and this is actually the most damaging for the multilateral trading system, I would say. So policies that are going to influence trading partners in imposing policy against other countries are very damaging from the multilateral trading system perspective, but also are the ones that are going to result in fragmentation. Because going back to the story about the connector economies, those are the ones that actually will play against those connector economies. And with that, I finish my presentation. As I said, we have the Global Trade Update series, which comes out every month. And every quarter, we have these faction figures. We provide some indication about what has been going on in the trade during the last quarter. We also have an annual publication, which is the key statistics and trends in international trade, and this goes back a little bit more into the medium term. We also, in the division, we have a lot of trade information about tariff and non-tariff measures. So if you are interested in those topics, please contact us. Also, if you have comments, suggestions about those publications and other publications, please tell us, because we are continuously updating them and trying to make them more useful.